And sometimes it got quite out of hand, and we'll talk about that later when we talk more about the monastic movement. Kenneth Scott Latourette, one of my favorite church historians, also agrees about the Montanists. He said, it, meaning Montanism, prized the records of the teachings of Christ and his apostles, but it believed, although not contradicting what had been said there, that the Holy Spirit continued to speak through the prophets, and among these it included women. So from Latourette's assessment, we would have to say that the real problem with Montanism, as much as it was a problem, was simply the idea that they believed that the Holy Spirit spoke in their own time and sometimes spoke through women. We must say that in important matters of doctrine, Montanists were sometimes in the very forefront of the defense of the faith. For example, Tertullian, the prominent Montanist, was instrumental in helping to express an orthodox understanding of the Trinity when the Christological heresy was fermenting. The credentials of Montanism as a generally doctrinally orthodox movement are very strong. However, there are several doctrinal distinctives of Montanism that would probably make us feel uncomfortable. First, and perhaps most significant of all, Montanists considered, now listen carefully here, Montanists considered his movement to be the inauguration of a new movement of the Holy Spirit. Really, a new dispensation of God's dealing with man. Montanists theorized that there were 4 stages of man's relationship to God throughout history. First, he said there was the stage of natural religion, or the innate idea of God. Secondly, he said that there was the stage of legal religion, demonstrated by the Old Testament and God's covenant of law with Israel. Thirdly, he said there was the stage of the gospel, having begun during the earthly ministry of Jesus. And finally, he said that there was the stage of the Holy Spirit's revelation as manifest in the spiritual sensitivity of the Montanists. Now again, I want you to understand, do you really grab onto what he was saying? He was saying, we are launching a whole new work of God's Spirit in His redemptive plan. And you have to admit, that's a pretty big claim to make, right? Montanists believed that the coming of the Paraclete, of the Holy Spirit, was only complete in the movement that he inaugurated. In other words, he would say that the stage of the gospel, having begun during the earthly ministry of Jesus, did not, if you want to say, completely launch the ministry of the Holy Spirit, but the ministry of the Holy Spirit was only completely launched in His own day. He declared that this age of the Spirit, as he talked about his 4th category, had superseded the age of Christ, even as what he said, the age of Christ superseded what he called stage 2, which would be the age of the Father. Now, you might say that Montanist was a dispensational thinker before dispensationalism. But it must be pointed out that there's no evidence that he embraced what you might call the Jesus-only doctrine that came in later. Montanist also considered himself as the chief prophet for the Paraclete, in other words, the Holy Spirit, interpreting the fulfillment of John 14:16 and 16:7. At his baptism, Montanist said that he spoke with tongues and he began prophesying, declaring that the Holy Spirit, promised in the gospel according to John, was finding utterance through him. Now, so far, with just what I tell you, how would you regard the Montanist movement? Generally orthodox, right? Maybe a little weird Pentecostal, right? A little weird with some strange beliefs about their own age. Maybe, you might say with this business, a little puffed up with pride, right? We're inaugurating a new age, but there's certainly nothing in this that would make me say, oh, they're heretics. Oh, they're not real believers. At worst, you would say they're a little weird in their idea of this new movement of the Holy Spirit. This perception of a new era of God's dealing with the church, it really did a lot to shape the way that the Montanists saw themselves and the way that outsiders saw their movement. I mean, let's face it. If you go around saying, God has us on the forefront of His brand new thing, that's sort of a proud statement, isn't it? It creates pride within yourself, and you can't blame other people for sort of seeing you as proud when you talk that way. Another doctrinal distinctive of the Montanists was their firmly held belief in the second coming of Jesus Christ. This group was emphatically premillennial, and they laid strong emphasis on the imminent return of Jesus Christ. They said, let's be ready for the return of Jesus today. Now, in Montanism, unfortunately, this also got extreme and kind of crazy. The leading prophets of Montanism announced the specific place of Jesus' return, a city of Asia Minor named Papusa. Just think about that. It would be as some prophets today say, Jesus Christ is coming soon, and he's coming to Shpital. You know, that's where he's going to touch down on the earth. You kind of say, well, what about the scriptures that say he's returning to Israel, and he's returning to the Mount of Olives, and so forth and so on? Well, they sort of disregarded those. Many believers who were sympathetic to the Montanists flocked to Papusa to await the coming of Christ. And so many came that the Christian communities of some Asia Minor villages were effectively depopulated. However, when people were disappointed by this unwise eschatological expectation, they soon went back to their place, and the idea of the coming kingdom in Jerusalem was soon substituted. In all of this, the doctrines of Montanism, though some of them were definitely strange, and we would say, let's stay away from those doctrines, there wasn't anything extremely unorthodox. They didn't deny the Trinity. They didn't deny the saving work of Jesus Christ. They just generally had a few strange ideas about the doctrine of the Holy Spirit and a few eschatologically strange ideas. Now, as a movement distinguished by a desire to continually experience spiritual gifts, it's not as strange. We would expect it that the Montanists would be familiar with the manifestations of the Holy Spirit in their own congregations. Philip Schaff said this. He said that in Montanist meetings, scenes took place similar to those under the preaching of the first Quakers and the glossolalia and prophesying in the Irvingite congregations. Now, Schaff wrote that from a 19th century perspective because that's when he lived and wrote. If he was writing in the 20th century, he probably would have said Pentecostal, but that was before the time of Schaff. He would have talked about it in terms of the Pentecostal movement or the charismatic resurgence. You see, among the contemporaries of Montanism, it was agreed that genuine supernatural phenomenon was happening among the Montanists. Some of the critics said that the phenomenon was the manifestation of the devil and not the Holy Spirit, but the reality of spiritual phenomenon among the Montanists was indeed very well attested. I find one of the most fascinating documents relevant to this is something written by Tertullian. Tertullian describes for us what a Montanist meeting was like, and let's take a look at that together. It's in your handouts, but you can also look up on the PowerPoint. As we read here, Tertullian said, "We have now among us a sister whose lot it has been to be favored with sundry gifts of revelation, which she experiences in the Spirit by ecstatic vision amidst the sacred rites of the Lord's day in the church. She converses with angels and sometimes even with the Lord. She both sees and hears mysterious communications. Some men's heart she understands, and to those who are in need she distributes remedies, whether it be in the reading of the Scriptures or in the chanting of the Psalms or in the preaching of sermons or in the offering up of prayers. In all these religious services, matter and opportunity are afforded to her of seeing visions." Now, can we just sort of tear this apart a little bit and understand what Tertullian's saying here? We have now among us a sister. Now, by the way, does he ever name the sister? No, he doesn't. Which I think is healthy, right? The idea isn't to glorify an individual who has these experiences, but he's just saying there's a particular sister among us, an anonymous sister among them, whose lot it has been to be favored with sundry gifts of revelation. In other words, he's recognizing that these were just bestowed on her. It's not because she's more spiritual. It's not because she has a hotline to God that nobody else does. It's just God's giving to her that she has these revelations, which she experiences in the Spirit by ecstatic vision amidst the sacred rites of the Lord's day in the church. In other words, while the church service is going on, she's receiving these visions. Sometimes it's as if she's conversing with angels. You wonder if this isn't referring to speaking in tongues, conversing with angels. And sometimes even with the Lord, she both sees and hears mysterious communications. Some men's hearts she understands. This is what we would call the biblical gift of knowledge, or perhaps a word of wisdom. And to those who are in need, she distributes remedies. I mean, this just seems like a flow of the gifts of the Spirit through this particular woman. Now, by the way, you would have to say that not